A little bit about my poems know that there's a lot of form working. And form is, as Brad said in the introduction, is only the pressure that you put on the lines. That's all it is. It's pressure. All right? Now you think that, well, you don't want that pressure. Nobody wants that pressure. But if you don't have that pressure, the line doesn't become anything else. But the form of the line, no matter if you're writing a villanelle or a sestina or a sonnet or whatever you're doing, every poem, even without form, has a form. That is the form of the poem. The formless poem is the most difficult poem in the world to write because it's inventing its own strategies of digging out the content. You see, the poem has a strategy. In your mind somewhere, there's the shape of what you want it to look like on the page, whether you are aware of this consciously or not. There's a shape, all right? And it may be amorphous, but what you're looking for is to probe that shape. You may want to write a poem in the form of the letter Z. I mean, there are crazier forms than that. I mean, that people have used, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You must put pressure on the form that whatever you express, which you don't know yet, because it hasn't been given to you, okay, takes. And whenever you're composing, that's a fancy word for what's happening. I don't know what the right word would be, but whenever you're in that zone of feeling the need to formulate something, it's very amorphous, you know. And it doesn't occur to you. I remember going to Breadloaf when I was a hot-shot kid in graduate school, and I was taking poetry classes with Robert Lowell, and Ann Sexton was my buddy in the class. And at that time, Frost was in charge of the Frost and another fellow, I forget his name, Morrison, Theodore Morrison, the great naval historian, and his wife were taking care of Frost in Cambridge. And so I was privileged to visit Frost several times, just me and him and an Indian poet named Nyack Chakrabarti. And so Frost, he leaned over the podium like this. He gave one speech he gave one poetry reading one night of each summer's Red Loaf Writers' Conference. I remember Frost came in. He had this gigantic granite head. And he had fingers. They were as big, thick around as a Polish sausage. And he's leaning over like this, and he doesn't say anything. He's just leaning over the podium like this. And he's looking out in the audience and saying anything. And then he says, "Has anything occurred to you since last year?" He had it. I mean, this is exactly what's going on. He knew what creative writing is. Has anything occurred to you? Now, if something occurs to you, where does it come from? You don't know. You have no idea. But you know that when you're in the kitchen and you go into the living room to do something, and by the time you get into the living room, you can't remember what it was that you were after. So how do you find out? You go back to the kitchen. And all of that environment of the kitchen, 9 times, not always, but 9 times out of 10, you'll rethink of what it was that you went into the living room for. And writing poetry is a little bit like that. Only the kitchen is that zone that you get in, and you begin to probe, and stuff begins to be given to you. All right? Anyway, no more preaching. I started to talk about the form. What I started to talk about was the form of this poem that I'm going to read, Pickerel Fishing. I must be pushing it at time here. Am I? It must be 8:30. All right? Okay, this is what the poem looks like. Those of you who know the book know what it looks like. But it starts out with how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines. Okay, 10 lines. And you look at the last one, they're half a line. All right? 9 lines, 8 lines, 7 lines, 6 lines, 5 lines, 4 lines. Try that. See if you can make it come out. All right? Go ahead, try it. All right? This takes place at Great East Lake in Acton, Maine. It's near Sanford. It's not very far down east. It's about 100 miles from. That's about 80 miles from Boston. All right. And this was Shangri-La. This was the Garden of Eden for me when I was a kid. In 1938, my father bought 50-foot of frontage for $25. And he bought lumber for $37, and we built what we called a camp, not a cottage. We called it camps. But they were summer places, you know, although we did go down in the winter. And we enjoyed that place for 50 years. Anyway, I loved it. It was my Eden. I mean, when I was down, it just solved. My mother and father never had one fight at the lake. This is something. They had fights at home. It was always about money, and nobody can. And kids who go through the family battlefield have a different everything when they're growing up than kids who grow up in a very happy household. I mean, and nobody can do anything about it. This is just the way it is. And if you can get through that stuff, if you're a kid, and you can come out on the other side of it, and you're still stable, that's great. And I think I came out on the other side of it. But they did. But down the lake, it was, honest to God, we go down there in those 3 weeks or those weekends in the fall. Jesus, it was. I was totally. I felt, at least, whole. You know. So I used to go up to the spring up the road. We had no running water. We had no electricity in the place. So I used to go up to the spring with this tall milk can, you know, and I could even drag it, you know, it was full of water. It was heavier than I was. And anyway, this is about, it's called pickerel fishing. But the plot of it is going to the spring for water. My Uncle Harry had a camp next to ours, and he was a Maine. He came from Maine. My whole family came from the state of Maine. I was the 11th generation from the Battle of Dunbar. And my 11th generation grandfather, you know, was captured at the Battle of Dunbar by Oliver Cromwell and shipped to New Hampshire, and he bought land in York, Maine, because he worked off his indenture in 7 years, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. The white pines dripped green over the dark road to the spring, and I sauntered in my tilting, swinging gait, loft-headed as the milk can tinned the color of bronze weighed my right arm down, swinging the can, Indian quiet, on the pine needles, eyeing the clumped green edges of the powdery summer-burnt dirt road, watching for frogs, daydreaming of the sleek pickerel in the nearby cove, going for spring water. I was 5. I was a pickerel myself, dreaming of a lady pickerel lounging in shallow, warm water, her frog-hungry tongue on hold, amputated arms brushing imperceptibly like a runner folded at the starting gun, drowsy and beagle-eyed in her green and yellow casing, casement black, her long muscle alert to move in a lightning jab, and the long chew, the frog's leg dangling from her locked jaw, disappearing into the maw like my father, sucking a drop of tobacco juice at the corner of his mouth, into the plug inside his mouth, chewing in the sun at the other end of the boat, watching the water, and me watching the water, holding my long bamboo pole to the quiet water where the swirl occurred on the path to the spring. Dizzy with August, mosquitoes rising from my feet on the damp path, dragging my can in the shallow spring, riling the bottom, eyeing the wood frog goggling 2 feet from my hand, swiping my left hand in front of his nose the way you lead a duck, pickereling up from a grass-quilted slough, his feet dangling from the mouth of my hand, and I put him in the can, and I clumped the tin cover on. Back at the camp, my Uncle Harry asked me if the tumbler was still in the stick. And I thought it was a joke. What was a tumbler? And he said, a tumbler. Again. And then he took the lid off and saw the floating frog and swore. And my father laughed. All I could think of was a clown tumbling at the spring and me grabbing the spotted brown blur in midair. I was 15 before I knew a tumbler was a drinking glass. For years it was there, upside down, and I saw it, and then it was gone. My Uncle Harry and my father were gone too. Last summer, I cleared the leaves and sticks that cluttered the spring with no goggling frog, but someone had placed another tumbler on an old broken stick.